Dr. Jake Morrison thought he knew everyone at Metropolitan General Hospital. He'd been working the night shift in the emergency department for 8 months, and the faces had become familiar. The nurses, the technicians, the cleaning staff, they were all part of his routine. But there was one man he barely noticed, a quiet night security guard who seemed to blend into the shadows of the hospital corridors. Frank Wilson had been walking these halls for 12 years, carrying his flashlight and radio, checking doors and windows with the steady rhythm of someone who took his job seriously but never made a fuss about it. At 58, he moved with the careful pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely solved problems. His gray hair was always neatly trimmed, his uniform pressed, and his thermos of coffee never far from reach. If this story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe to help us share more incredible tales of hidden heroes. Your support helps us bring these amazing stories to light, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Jake had exchanged maybe 20 words with Frank in all those months. A nod in the hallway, a brief "good evening" when their paths crossed, maybe a comment about the weather. Frank seemed content to remain invisible, and Jake was too busy learning to be a doctor to pay much attention to a security guard who appeared to have nothing remarkable about him. The emergency department at Metro General never truly slept, but the hours between midnight and dawn had their own particular rhythm. It was during these quiet hours that Jake often found himself thinking about his future, wondering if he had what it took to handle the pressure of emergency medicine. At 26, he was the youngest resident in the program, and sometimes he felt like everyone could see his uncertainty. Frank would often pause during his rounds to glance through the glass doors of the emergency department. Jake assumed he was just checking to make sure everything was secure, but there was something else in the older man's expression, a kind of watchful concern that went beyond basic security protocols. When Jake caught his eye, Frank would nod politely and continue on his way, his footsteps echoing softly down the empty corridors. One Tuesday night in November, Jake was struggling with a particularly difficult case. An elderly man had come in with chest pain, and despite running every test Jake could think of, he couldn't pinpoint the problem. The patient's symptoms didn't quite fit any textbook diagnosis, and Jake found himself second-guessing every decision. Frank appeared at the nurse's station, signing in for his hourly check. He glanced toward the treatment room where Jake was working and paused for a moment longer than usual. When Jake emerged, looking frustrated and exhausted, Frank approached him quietly. "Rough night, Doc?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a warmth that Jake hadn't noticed before. Jake rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, challenging case. Sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for this." Frank studied Jake's face with the kind of attention that made the young doctor feel suddenly visible. "Mind if I ask what's got you stumped?" Jake hesitated. It wasn't exactly protocol to discuss patient cases with security personnel, but there was something in Frank's manner that suggested genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "Elderly gentleman, classic chest pain presentation, but his EKG is normal, cardiac enzymes are negative, and his vital signs are stable. I'm probably overthinking it, but something feels off." Frank nodded slowly. Sometimes the most dangerous cases are the ones that look routine on paper. You trust your instincts, document. They're usually trying to tell you something important. There was something in the way Frank spoke, a quiet confidence that suggested he'd dealt with medical emergencies before. Jake found himself wondering about the older man's background, but before he could ask, Frank had excused himself to continue his rounds. The patient turned out to have a rare form of angina that only showed up on specialized testing. Jake's instinct to dig deeper had been correct, and the man was successfully treated and discharged 2 days later. Jake made a mental note to thank Frank for the encouragement, but their paths didn't cross again for several days. The night that changed everything started like any other. Jake arrived for his shift at 11 p.m., grabbed coffee from the break room, and checked in with the day shift attending. The department was unusually quiet, only 2 patients in the waiting room and no ambulances on the way. Frank made his usual rounds, offering Jake a brief nod through the glass doors. At 2:17 a.m., everything changed. The radio crackled to life with an urgent dispatch: multiple vehicle accident on Interstate 75. Mass casualty incident. 8 vehicles involved. Multiple trauma patients inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Jake felt his heart rate spike. He'd handled individual trauma cases, but never anything like this. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, immediately activated the hospital's mass casualty protocol. Additional staff were called in, but it would take time for everyone to arrive. Morrison, Dr. Chen called out, you're going to be primary on Trauma Bay 3. We've got reports of at least 6 critical patients coming in. Jake nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. He'd trained for this, but training and reality were two very different things. As he prepared the trauma bay, his hands trembled slightly as he checked equipment and reviewed protocols in his mind. The first ambulance arrived with sirens wailing. Paramedics rushed in with a middle-aged woman who had been ejected from her vehicle. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, barely conscious. Jake's training kicked in as he began his assessment, but he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The second ambulance brought a teenage boy with severe head trauma. The third, a family of 3, including a young child who was conscious but clearly in shock from witnessing his parents' injuries. The emergency department transformed from quiet efficiency into controlled chaos. Jake found himself overwhelmed. Between Trauma Bay 3 and trying to help with overflow patients, he was struggling to prioritize. The teenage boy needed immediate surgery, but the woman with internal bleeding was deteriorating rapidly. The child was stable but traumatized, and Jake wasn't sure how to divide his attention effectively. That's when Frank appeared beside him. "Doc," Frank said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos, "you need to focus on one patient at a time. The boy needs neurosurgery now. That's not your call to make, it's Dr. Chen's. The woman in 3 is your priority. Her blood pressure is dropping, and she's showing signs of hemorrhagic shock." Jake stared at Frank in surprise. How did a security guard know about hemorrhagic shock? Frank continued, his voice calm and authoritative. "Get 2 large-bore IVs in her, type and cross for 6 units, and call surgery. She's got internal bleeding that's not going to stop on its own." "Frank, Jake started to protest, but Frank's expression stopped him. "Trust me, document. I've seen this before." Something in Frank's tone made Jake listen. He followed the older man's advice, and within minutes, the woman was stabilized and on her way to surgery. Frank had already moved on to help organize the chaos in the other trauma bays, quietly directing traffic and somehow making everything run more smoothly. Over the next hour, as more staff arrived and the immediate crisis passed, Jake watched Frank work. The man who had seemed like a simple security guard was moving through the department with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how emergency medicine worked. He anticipated needs, provided support where it was needed, and somehow managed to be everywhere at once without getting in anyone's way. When the last patient had been admitted or transferred, and the emergency department finally returned to its normal quiet, Jake found Frank sitting in the break room, his thermos of coffee open in front of him. "Frank," Jake said, sitting down across from him, "I need to ask you something." Frank looked up, his expression unreadable. "How did you know what to do back there?" "That wasn't security guard knowledge. That was medical training." Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying his coffee as if it held answers to questions Jake hadn't asked. "I wasn't always a security guard, document." Jake waited, sensing that Frank was deciding how much to share. 20 years, Special Forces. Army medic, then pararescue specialist. I've worked on more trauma cases than most emergency room doctors see in a lifetime. Jake felt his understanding of Frank Wilson completely shift. 20 years? Where? Iraq, Afghanistan, couple places that aren't on the maps. Anywhere soldiers got hurt and needed someone to patch them up fast. But why are you working security here? With that kind of experience, you could be Frank held up a hand. Could be what? Teaching at medical schools? Running emergency departments? Maybe. But I've seen enough trauma for one lifetime. This job lets me help without being responsible for life and death decisions. It lets me sleep at night. Jake was quiet, processing this revelation. But tonight, you jumped right back in. Frank smiled for the first time since Jake had known him. Old habits. When people need help, you help them. Doesn't matter if you're wearing combat fatigues or a security uniform. Frank, your knowledge, your experience. The hospital could use someone like you in a medical capacity. You could teach residents like me. You could Doc, Frank interrupted gently. I appreciate the thought, but I found my peace doing what I'm doing. Sometimes the best way to serve is quietly, without anyone knowing what you're capable of." Jake shook his head. "But your skills, your training, you're wasted doing security rounds." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Am I? Tonight I helped you save lives. I've been walking these halls for 12 years, watching over patients and staff, making sure everyone gets home safe. That's not wasted time, document. That's service." "Tell me about your military experience," Jake said. "What was it like?" Frank's expression grew distant. "Imagine being dropped into the worst day of someone's life, over and over again. Imagine having 30 seconds to decide whether someone lives or dies, with mortars going off around you and enemy fire trying to stop you from doing your job." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "I've performed surgery in bombed-out buildings, treated casualties in the back of moving helicopters, and kept soldiers alive when there was no reason they should have survived. I've held the hands of kids who were younger than you while they died thousands of miles from home." Jake sat in silence, beginning to understand why Frank had chosen a quiet job after such intense experiences. "After my last tour, I came home and couldn't sleep. Every emergency room reminded me of field hospitals. Every trauma case brought back memories I'd rather forget. So I found a job where I could still serve, still help people, but without the weight of constant life and death decisions." "But tonight was different," Frank admitted. "Tonight you needed help, and instinct took over. Muscle memory from 20 years of emergency medicine. I couldn't just stand by and watch you struggle when I knew what needed to be done." Jake leaned forward. "Frank, what you did tonight, your guidance, your knowledge, it made all the difference. That woman is alive because you knew exactly what I needed to do." Frank nodded slowly. "And that feels good, document. Better than I've felt in a long time." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of the evening's events settling between them. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake said finally. "Shoot. Do you ever regret leaving medicine? Do you ever wish you'd stayed in the field?" Frank considered the question carefully. "Regret is a dangerous word, document. I did what I needed to do at the time. Military medicine saved lives, but it also cost me pieces of myself. This job gave me back my peace of mind." "But you're so good at it. Your instincts, your knowledge, tonight proved that. And tonight also proved that experience never really leaves you. When it matters, when lives are on the line, training takes over. But that doesn't mean I need to make it my daily reality." Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own struggles with confidence and competence. "Frank, can I ask you for a favor?" "What's that? Would you be willing to talk with me sometimes?" "About cases, about medicine. I could use a mentor, and clearly you have more experience than most of the attendings here." Frank studied Jake's face, seeing something in the young doctor that reminded him of soldiers he'd worked with, good people who needed guidance to reach their potential. "I'll make you a deal, document. I'll share what I know, but not as a former Special Forces medic. Just as someone who's been around long enough to recognize good instincts when I see them." "Deal," Jake said immediately. Frank stood up, gathering his thermos and radio. "Now, I need to finish my rounds. These holes don't watch themselves." As Frank headed for the door, Jake called after him. "Frank." "Yeah, Doc. Thank you. For tonight, for everything." Frank paused at the doorway. "That's what we do, document. We watch out for each other." Over the following months, Jake and Frank developed an unusual but effective partnership. During quiet nights, Frank would share stories from his military experience, always framed as hypothetical situations rather than specific memories. Jake learned about field medicine, triage under pressure, and the kind of decision-making that came from years of experience in high-stakes situations. Frank never officially joined the medical staff, and most people in the hospital continued to see him as simply a dedicated security guard. But Jake knew better. He knew that Frank Wilson was one of the most skilled medical professionals he'd ever encountered, a man whose quiet competence had been forged in some of the most challenging Circumstances imaginable. 3 months after the mass casualty incident, Jake was working another busy night when a gang shooting brought in 4 critically injured teenagers. As he prepared to handle the complex case, he felt the familiar flutter of anxiety. But then he saw Frank's reflection in the glass doors, making his rounds, and Jake felt his confidence settle. Frank caught his eye and gave him a subtle nod, not the nod of a security guard acknowledging a doctor, but the nod of one professional recognizing another. Jake smiled and turned back to his patient, knowing that if he needed guidance, experience, and wisdom were just a radio call away. The teenagers all survived. 2 made full recoveries, and the other 2 went on to lead productive lives despite their injuries. Jake's handling of the case earned him recognition from the department chief, but he knew that his success was built on lessons learned from a man who chose to serve quietly, whose greatest achievements would never be recorded in any medical journal. Frank continued his rounds, continued his quiet service, and continued to be the guardian angel that Metropolitan General Hospital never knew it had. And sometimes, during the quietest hours of the night shift, he would pause at the emergency department doors and watch Jake work, seeing in the young doctor the kind of healer he himself had once been. Some heroes wear combat uniforms. Some wear surgical scrubs. And some wear security guard uniforms, carrying their experience quietly, ready to serve when service is needed most. Frank Wilson understood that true strength often comes wrapped in humility, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought in hospital corridors rather than on foreign battlefields. He had found his peace in service, his purpose in protection, and his satisfaction in knowing that sometimes the best way to save lives is to teach others how to save them. This is the story of a man who chose to serve quietly, whose greatest victories happened in shadows, and whose impact on others came not from seeking recognition, but from being exactly where he was needed, exactly when he was needed there.